Today's PowerPoint will focus on post-colonial Southeast Asia, primarily the region that was once known as Indochina and now known as Vietnam, as well as looking at New Zealand and Australia. The beginning of European control and influence in this region really began in the early 1500s during the Age of Exploration. The primary goal at that time for Europe was to obtain wealth through the trade industry, particularly the spice trade. The goal initially was not to set up colonies, rather just to set up different trade relations with various ports in these areas. Spain at this point would colonize the Philippines and would have control of them really up until the Spanish-American War at the end of the 1800s, but Great Britain certainly had made its mark into the 1600s, as well as the Dutch in regards to setting up ports throughout parts of Indonesia and, of course, India. Throughout the 1800s, this relationship between Europe and the Southeast Asian region will begin to change. And as we get through the 1800s, particularly starting in the mid-1800s, you start to have the development of European colonial control. Primarily, this is because of the growth of the Industrial Revolution starting in Great Britain. The need, of course, is for more resources, cheaper resources, and a direct line to those resources. These raw materials are coming out of areas like India, other parts of Indonesia, which of course we know mostly as the Philippines, and then certainly having far-reaching holds even as far into areas that we know now as Vietnam and China and Japan. All the European colonies are beginning to provide goods for the Industrial Revolution. One of the first strongholds in a location that was actually considered to be exotic at the time, Siam, will be an example of an early British colonial system that also will not be so easily swayed as becoming part of the colonial network. Nowadays we know Siam as Thailand. When the European countries start to focus on colonialism as a way of establishing their empire's control, they start to realize that if you're going to truly control a new area, you need to probably set up a government. Initially, as we've talked about in class, they either go the indirect route or the direct route. Primarily, these countries would set up an indirect use of, a form of government, and eventually it became evident that the best way to control these areas was really to establish a direct line of control. And that means, of course, you send your own government officials to actually control the colonies. The main goal of these colonies certainly was to produce commodities or raw materials or resources for Europe. Some of the most heavily traded commodities and wealth-producing commodities were in the rubber industry, and we talked about that with the Congo, but also sugar, rice, tea, and coffee. Eventually, you're going to have the sparking of nationalism within local tribes, and in some regards, you will have some tribal warfares that will erupt, but eventually, you start to see a pattern of tribes beginning to get along in the sense of recognizing that they are part of a greater nation, for better or worse. So essentially you will start to have longtime enemies becoming allies within certain countries. This does not, however, mean that they're okay with their European control, but they certainly are starting to work together as a more singular unit within that country. As we get into the more modern era, what becomes evident for many countries, particularly the ones in more of the far eastern region in Asia, is that Asia really should be established for Asians. And this happens to come into play even more so once you get into the early 1900s. We know from history that during World War II, Japan took over much of this region by, of course, going into China and committing quite a number of atrocities. Eventually, obviously, they are forced out after they lose in World War II. Some of the other things that become evident throughout Southeast Asia, especially if you look at China, for example, is that to have the same government that Europe had doesn't really, they believe, work for them, and it's a bad situation. And certainly this is going to lead to the prominence of Mao Zedong and the growth of communism in China, and ultimately we'll start to see that creep into areas like Korea and Vietnam as well. After World War II, many of the countries that were previously under colonial control wanted their independence, and for the most part, the European nations are reluctantly giving up control of those regions. However, what happens, of course, is a power vacuum emerges, which means basically that once Europe leaves and the European powers leave and the government leaves, who should be in charge in these kind of newly freed or newly independent countries? One of the more significant battles that happens in the 40s is that Indonesia actually has to fight for their independence from the Dutch between 1945 to 49. That's kind of lost in history. The Dutch were not eager to give up their access to Indonesia because that was such a source of wealth for them, but ultimately they are forced to do so. One region that is nowadays known as a collection of three countries, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, was previously known as Indochina, and in the 1800s into the 1900s, the French controlled this region. When you get closer into the 1940s, the country of Vietnam and the Vietnamese forces will basically start to push for independence from French control, and they will defeat the French. Of course, this is an embarrassment for France. Our initial take is that we're okay with this until we start to realize that, of course, there is these different political forces at play, and that communism seems to be making a stronghold, of course, not only in China, but is starting to creep into northern parts of Korea, and then also starting to creep into northern parts of Vietnam. Keep in mind, folks, that this is right at the beginning of the Cold War, and so we talk about the idea of proxy wars, and there was a real concern that communism was going to continue to spread throughout the world. China, a huge landmass, a huge population at this point, had already fallen to the communist powers or communist belief structure. And we were very concerned, as we've talked about in U.S. history classes, the idea of a domino theory, that if one country falls to communism, more and more countries will fall like dominoes to communism. And we did not want that to happen. So when you talk about, why is the Vietnam War fought, or why was it fought rather, it's because we wanted to support the people in Vietnam who did not want to become communist. And so we literally are fighting a war against communism. If you look at the dates there for the Vietnam War, you'll notice that it says 1957 to 1975, and you might be a little surprised because you're mostly taught that the Vietnam War happens in the 60s. But keep in mind that the military action and the military buildup as far as communism creeping in actually begins in the 50s. And we already have people, primarily the CIA, that are involved in kind of background military movements in the Vietnam War. We know as the war progresses into 1975, it becomes rather obvious that the U.S. is not going to be able to maintain control along with the support of the South Vietnamese. And so we leave. And the South is forced to surrender to the North Vietnamese forces, which means that with that surrender, communists take over not only South Vietnam, but they also at this point were able to take over Cambodia and Laos. So what started as an area that had been controlled by the French for about 100 years, once they left, a new political system had to emerge. That political system was communism. And they are eventually successful enough and are able to take over what we used to call Indochina. Why we should care about the Vietnam War nowadays, even more so than it just being a war that we were involved in, is that it has had long-lasting impact, particularly in regards to the population demographics of Minnesota, which means the different ethnicities and ethnicities and minorities that we have in this state. One of the groups that supported the United States in what was called the secret war in regards to Vietnam was the Hmong population. And the Hmong population identifies themselves, of course, as a ethnic group that does have a different religion, but they are an ethnicity. They were primarily individuals that lived in Laos, Vietnam, and China. Most of them, their life back in the 60s and 70s, they were farmers in the hillsides of these countries, in the jungle hillsides. And they did not support the communist forces. They were concerned that as a different ethnic group in that region and as a minority group in that region, that the communist forces would essentially want to get rid of them really in any means possible. And to be honest, that's exactly what was going to happen. When you watch the outbreak of Vietnam, one of the things we do know from history is that the North Vietnamese used this trail known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It was kind of the nickname for it, that was basically a supply line that ran into Laos and Cambodia and essentially would allow the North Vietnamese to send goods down to support their allies, the Viet Cong, in their fight against the U.S. So basically, they had supplies in the north. They knew they couldn't shuttle them down through the country of Vietnam, so they sent them to the neighboring countries down this trail to get to the south. The U.S. government at this time, this is into the 70s, we don't want to make it public that we're also fighting war in Laos. We know that already Vietnam is so incredibly unpopular, so we don't want to get involved in anything else, or at least let the American people know. So what we do is we hire and train Hmong fighters to fight in what we called a secret war. Of course, this was not publicized. The CIA had promised a life in the U.S. for any of these Hmong fighters after the war was over. Of course, the idea was that we were going to win this war in Vietnam, and we would be fully able to bring these guys, and their families over to the U.S. The idea was that if they stayed there, there was real concern that they would not be safe, so we essentially promised them safety if they helped us out. Unfortunately, the outcome was not what we wanted. We had to evacuate rather quickly our guys from Vietnam in 1975, and so these promises of giving these people amnesty or safety in the U.S. Essentially fall on deaf ears. When you look at the end of the war in Vietnam, we look at about 58,000 U.S. casualties, but you have almost 100,000, if not more, Hmong casualties, and there's going to be many more that will die or be put in essentially refugee camps or prison camps after the North Vietnamese take control. There were about 100,000 Hmong that were brought over since the end of Vietnam to the United States, and since that time more and more have come into the U.S. There's roughly 50,000 that live in Thai refugee camps nowadays, but what started to happen, and really this is even more so 10 years ago where this was more prevalent, but Thailand was ready to start to send Hmong refugees back to Laos. And the Hmong refugees knew they couldn't go back to Laos because Laos is still communist and they would not be welcomed there. They could be put in camps or worse, killed, whatever the case may be. So the United Nations started to get involved really in the 80s and into the 90s. And they started to make this push for trying to bring over these refugees to the United States because, let's be honest, that's what the U.S. had initially promised. You have quite a few Lutheran churches, in particular in Wisconsin and Minnesota, that in the end of the 80s, especially into the 90s, and of course even nowadays, started to sponsor refugees in the U.S. We have kind of a first wave in 1975, but it really starts to ramp up in the 80s. These churches will help these families get established by providing them jobs and housing. And once they get established, then it was easier for their relatives to come over. Because if you want to become a citizen of the U.S. from another country, if you're trying to become, to gain amnesty or refugee status, you need to have some place that you can go. That's part of the requirements, is that there's somebody here to help you. And that basically, starting in 1975, has allowed an increase of Hmong refugees to come and settle in the U.S. and become U.S. citizens. We have certainly here in Minnesota seen an influx of Hmong populations, particularly in the St. Paul area. Certainly in Farmington, we have an influx of Hmong students, not as much as the urban areas and the cities, but we have had more and more Hmong students throughout the years, and some of them are your classmates. We are fortunate enough to have an actual account of what it was like to live through this region and experience some of these situations. And I will post that story for you guys on Schoology for you to look at. But as you guys notice from this chart, you can see that really California and Minnesota are the top two regions for Hmong populations. Next, we shift our attention a little bit further to the south and focus on the areas of Australia and New Zealand and what they have really gone through in a relatively short amount of time. The population of Australia is close to about 20 million. Of course, most of those people are living in the coastal regions, particularly in the eastern coastal region. Australia itself, this fact is a little wrong, kind of cross that out there. Australia is really established as a Commonwealth of the British Empire in 1901, so they're a little bit older than 79 years old. One of the more remarkable things about them is that they have 100% or pretty much as close as you can get to 100% literacy in their country. We, of course, think of Australia and think of the animals and whatnot, but there's certainly a much richer history to this country. One of the things that gets lost with Australian history is that it really was an island that was inhabited by a native population. I mean, we're talking inhabited 40,000 years before the British actually even set foot on the island. We call this group Aborigines or the Aboriginal people, but they're really not just one group of individuals. There are about 500 different Aborigine groups that speak about 200 different languages. They have a rather complex religious belief structure, system, and social structure. And that kind of goes down to each tribe has its own established kind of rules and regulations. They still, for the most part, to this day, are viewed as a nomadic people. They kind of course, back in the day, followed their food source, but nowadays they still kind of move around, particularly living in the outback of Australia. They represent about 1% of the population of Australia, and nowadays they are finally getting some recognition, but it was a very long and tumultuous history for them as far as being recognized as part of Australia and gaining rights. We know that the British explorer James Cook discovered Australia in 1770. It, however, did not take very long for Great Britain to basically take over the island and call it Australia in 1788. They set up Australia, as many of you guys know, as what we would call a penal colony, meaning that it is basically an island where they are going to send their crooks. It's like a penitentiary. They will initially start to send people there that they don't want in Great Britain anymore. They will also start to send people there that they don't want in Ireland or Scotland. And so it essentially becomes an island where you're kind of banished. Initially, there are some prisons there. And then eventually what would happen is you maybe serve your time in prison and then they just kind of let you out, but you can't leave. To go along with that, eventually Great Britain sends prostitutes down there. And that is basically how you establish the population of Australia. Unfortunately, there was an Aboriginal people that lived there, and they, of course, like many of native populations, will be exploited and overlooked, and they will start to lose their land. The British policy will be that, well, these native people, they don't use their land the right way. They aren't farming on it. They aren't ranchers. So we should just take it away and do something with it. Perhaps you guys have heard of something like this in U.S. history before. One of the saddest parts of this history refers to a period from 1909 to 1969 known as the Stolen Generation. During that 60-year period, 100,000 Aboriginal children were taken from their families and given to British families to raise. The idea was that you could force this group to give up their culture and to adopt the majority culture, which was the British culture. Aborigines still, to this point, have anger over the stolen generation. There hasn't been much of reparations or payments to these families for having their kids ripped away from them. Today, they are still fighting to try to maintain their traditions and maintain the Aboriginal way of life, and try to kind of have a resurgence of it as an important part of the Australian culture. It's not until the 1960s that Aborigines are actually given full citizenship under Australian law. And in 1976, something is passed known as the Land Rights Act, which gave Aborigines the right to claim land in the northern part of the territory. So it's kind of like the equivalent of setting up reservations, I guess you could say, in the U.S. The biggest problem with this is that really the Aborigine belief structure is that you kind of share the land. It's very similar to the Native American belief structure here in the U.S. So that really hasn't solved everything, but it was supposed to at least give them a spot, if you will, where they wouldn't be bothered in Australia. The primary economy in Australia continues to be the meat industry, agricultural rather, focusing on beef cattle in particular, wool, and then butter. They have quite a few large ranching plantations. Ranching is a big way of life, particularly when you start to get out into the western part of Australia. They also have diamond mines, lead mines, zinc, coal, and iron ore. One of the biggest problems, however, is that most of these resources are in the outback, the Australian outback, which unfortunately, not only is this going to start to impact the beauty of the outback, outback rather, as far as the environment is concerned, but who's living there? The Aborigines. And so there's been a conflict with their living space versus kind of the modern economy and whatnot. The culture of Australia certainly stems from a very strong British culture. They primarily are of the Christian religion, unless, of course, you're Aborigine. They drink tea still. They drive on the left side of the road. They speak English. They enjoy British sports, but there is the Australian style football. We'd call it more so like kind of Aussie rules football. It's a little bit of rugby and traditional U.S. football. They are still a sovereign nation of the UK, and along with that, they have been our allies in World War One, World War Two. World War Two, they actually got very close to being taken over by Japan. There's a lot of really intense battle sequences that occurred during that, if you're kind of interested in finding out that history. And then they also support us in Iraq and Afghanistan. They do actually view the Queen as still she's kind of actually part of their government. They have really a three-part government, and she still kind of oversees, really as a figurehead, part of their government. She doesn't have a whole lot of actual power in Australia. But if you guys look at the flag there on the bottom, there's the flag. You can see that still shows the Union Jack, the British flag up in the corner, to really represent the fact that they are still a sovereign nation of the United Kingdom. New Zealand was also discovered by James Cook roughly around the same time that Australia was. So the dates here aren't quite right. It's very close to the same age, if you will, of Australia's discovery. They also have great success with about 100% literacy. And as you guys notice on the flag there, they're also viewed as a part of the Commonwealth still to this day of the British Empire. The primary elements of their economy are meat and wool production. There's a lot of sheep actually in New Zealand. Their climate and their geography are situated to really support those two industries, primarily ranching, and then butter production with the dairy there, and then kiwi. Now kiwi is kind of funny because there's the kiwi bird, which is like an emu that lives in New Zealand. It's kind of specialized, and so kiwi is kind of a nickname for people from New Zealand. So, oh, you're a kiwi. But also the kiwi fruit, although not originally from there, it's originally from China, was actually brought there when the British colonized the region. And actually kiwi fruit was one of the first significant international exports from New Zealand. Primarily because the U.S. soldiers during World War II that would take their leave in New Zealand actually really liked the taste of it, and it kind of got a foothold back in the U.S. Tourism's on the rise. You probably maybe know somebody that's actually gone to New Zealand. And that industry really has to pick up soon because some of the agricultural things are lacking and the economy is starting to suffer a bit. If you go there, you can ski, you can mountain climb, you can hunt, certainly, but they also have quite a bit of nice coastal regions, so you have surfing and also quite a bit of British sports. So you really get this strong influence, if you haven't realized this already, of this kind of leftover British colonial foothold in Australia and New Zealand. And really, it's kind of in the last 150 years that they've made this presence, and it's still very much a part of their culture. New Zealand also had a very strong native population that lived there before James Cook and the British showed up. The Maori people are very similar to the Aborigine people in Australia. They comprise about 15% of the New Zealand population nowadays. What's unique is that the British, the English language rather, and then the Maori language are the official languages in New Zealand, and that the British, in New Zealand's case, actually accepted some of their traditions, which is kind of unique. Today, most people in New Zealand are of British descent. The term that the Maoris gave to these people of, British or European descent was Pakeas, and so you might hear that term. If you were to go to New Zealand today, you might hear that term as well. If you're kind of looking at more like a popular person to come out of New Zealand, the singer Lorde is from New Zealand, as some of you guys know, and her two biggest hits at this point, or at least her debut hits, Royals and then Team, reference her life in New Zealand, particularly if you look at royals talking about kind of being a country that's in the Eastern Hemisphere, but very much wanting to be or having this kind of Western Hemisphere influence, yet they're kind of forgotten. And if you actually looked at the lyrics, you can see kind of her references to things that are about the West that they have exposure to, but don't really, can't really expect to live like that. So it's kind of interesting if you guys take a look at it. Kind of brings it into the present. So after viewing this slideshow and then looking a little bit more at your own independent research, I ask you to answer the following and to put it on either a notability document or do it on paper and hand it in. But I want you to consider how was Australia's stolen generation similar to U.S. policies in regards to how we treated Native Americans. So I discussed this in the PowerPoint. Go back to that if you don't remember, but jot down what you think. The next one is describe the controversial testing that happened on an area known as the Bikini Islands, which is actually in this region off the coast, and what are some of the lasting problems with that. And then finally, why were rabbits introduced to Australia and what was the outcome? And then finally, how is Australia fighting this problem? So some of these you can find in your book or you can do your own independent research, but please go ahead and answer these in some nice complete sentences and Dropbox them. And then finally, if you want something a little funny to watch, and it's only about a minute and 20 seconds, there was this video created by kind of an Australian comedy group called 10 Reasons to Come or Not Come to Australia if you're considering, taking a trip there. So enjoy.